Hello and welcome to Rich Rides. This week is another bike review. The bike I'm reviewing is the Moto Guzzi V7 3 Stone. When it comes to the looks of this bike, then I think it looks fantastic. So it's got that sort of retro style. It's got gaiters on the front, that classic sort of brat style seat, really low seat height. It looks a cracking bike. Even people that weren't into bikes were commenting on the pictures that I was putting up of this. Onto the ergonomics of the bike, so the seating position, all those kinds of things. So the seat height is very low, so it's a very easy bike for people of any height. It's quite a large-ish seat, but we did try riding with someone pillion, and it was a bit short for that, and they said they felt like they were going to fall off onto the Mudguard because it does have a strange slope at the back. It looks great, but I'd sort of only recommend it for one person really. Comfort-wise, really comfortable. So the suspension's on the harder side, so it's not completely soft, but one day I was riding about 6 hours in total, and yes, we had some breaks within that, but felt completely fine at the end of the day. So it's a very comfortable bike. Wind protection, there is zero wind protection with it being a naked bike, so you do get a little bit battered, but that's just like any naked bike. The mirrors work well. At first when I got on the bike I thought they looked a bit too modern for it, but like I say, they work well. You do get some vibrations through them, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. Onto the switchgear. So strangely it just has one dial rather than sort of two dials. That's just the speedo, and it has an LCD. Like I say, strangely it doesn't have a rev counter, and the engine does run out of revs fairly quickly. So that's a bit of an omission that I'd have liked to have seen. As I say, it has an LCD display within that speedo binnacle, and that shows loads of really good stuff. All controlled very simply. On your right hand side you've just got a mode button, and you can quickly go through that. So you can show things like your miles per gallon, it's got your trip meters, there's also a gear position indicator on, but like I say, strangely no rev counter at all. And slight annoyance, there's no fuel gauge at all, and you'd think that if it's showing your average miles per gallon, a fuel gauge would be useful too, but all it has is a fuel light. So a bit of a strange omission, and I don't know why they didn't put a fuel gauge on there. So onto the engine, ride and brakes, those kinds of things. So the engine itself, it's around 750cc. As I mentioned when I was talking about the comfort, there's quite a lot of vibrations from this engine, and being honest, it feels a bit old and agricultural. When you rev it, it physically moves the bike right, which is a bit disconcerting at first. So even if you just sat at standstill and rev the bike, it will physically move right. So that's a bit strange. And even if you sort of flip the throttle as you're going down through the gears, you can feel the bike sort of pull you to the right. Like I say, a bit strange, but you do get used to that. Power-wise, I'd say it's adequate. It's only 52 horsepower, and I expected a little more torque than it actually has. And it doesn't rev that much either. It runs out of revs fairly quickly. It does have a light on the dashboard to tell you when you're approaching that rev limit that flashes red, so you do hit that limiter much sooner than you'd expect now. As I said, it feels a bit old and agricultural, but it's adequate and it does the job. Some people would say it gives it character, which I agree it does, but some people just say it's not great. The gearbox as well, then again, that feels fairly clunky, and neutral is, of all the bikes I've ever ridden, which is quite a lot now, it's the only one I've struggled with neutral. Probably 1 in 20 chances when I was stopped at traffic lights and things like that, could I actually find neutral fairly quickly. So, like I say, engine and gearbox are its weakest point really. Again, with the engine, then I'd say it's quite tappety, or the bike I had certainly was, and it seemed a well looked after bike. So the engine itself is quite loud, but not in a good way. I think the exhaust sounds alright, but I thought it would sound better than it did. So I definitely have to have aftermarket cans on it. They look quite cool on this particular bike, on this Stone. It has matte black ones and one either side and look quite chunky, but I thought they'd be a bit louder. They may have sounded louder behind me, but I wasn't feeling the benefit of that. As far as braking is concerned, then this is a strong point of the bike. The brakes are great. It's got, even though it's only got single disc on the front, it's a Brembo, really controllable. So you could use the front brake a lot more than the back, even at low speeds, and it was nice and controllable. So the rear brake as well, that was decent too. So the brakes are pretty good. So for motorway and touring, then I think there's better bikes than this. Obviously it's a naked bike, so you're getting a lot of wind blast, but you are getting the vibrations from that engine as well. And especially once you're going over sort of 60, 65 miles an hour, then there's vibrations through the foot pegs, the handlebars, and as I mentioned earlier, the mirrors too. So it's probably not the best tourer, and of course you're not protected at all. Having said that, it's a very comfortable bike, so days out aren't bad, but if you were sat on motorways for any length of time, I'd be choosing a different bike if I had the option. So who's this bike aimed at? I think it's for people that want something that looks great, has character, and is mainly used for sort of cruising and A and B roads. Like I say, it looks great. One of the best things about this bike was the way it handles. So on those A and B roads, then I think the suspension works brilliantly. Slightly firmer than I expected, but that means that it handles nicely. And it was really, really good fun on the sort of twisty A roads. And it's got enough power to be interesting without you getting yourself into any trouble. The brakes work well, so again you can get your speeds right for cornering. So I think it works really well in those sorts of things. Some people could use it for commuting, but I found at low speeds, even though it's a fairly heavy-ish bike, around 200 kilos, it doesn't feel that, so I thought it was going to be fairly good for sort of traffic. But I found the throttle a bit snatchy. You had to have more revs than you thought, and there was a lot of play, and it was a bit on-off with the throttle. So at low speeds it wasn't great, so maybe not a great commuter. And as I mentioned before, then I don't think it's a great long-distance tourer either. But yeah, if you just want to have something to have fun at the weekends that looks the part, then I think this is a good option. Price-wise, I think it's a little bit expensive when there's other options around, like the Triumph Street Twin or even the Royal Enfield Interceptor. So I reviewed one of those recently. Of the two bikes, then the Interceptor feels a lot better bike. Looks-wise, I think it's as good. So it's an interesting comparison. That's the nearest bike, I think, to this Moto Guzzi that I've reviewed. And if it was my money, I'd be spending it on the Royal Enfield. So on to my usual positives and negatives. So on the positives, then the three things that I like best about the bike was number one, the looks fab. Number two was the comfort of the bike. I spent a lot of time, 5 days back-to-back riding, a couple of 100 kilometres most of those days, and was always super comfortable. And number three on my list is a bit of a combination between the way it handled and its build quality. It feels a well put together bike. So any negatives? As I've mentioned, then I think the biggest negative is the engine, unfortunately. It's quite lumpy at low revs, throttle snatchy, and it's quite a vibey engine of that. It's because of some of those things, it's more difficult than it should be to ride smoothly at low speeds, and like I say, just the vibrations do spoil it a bit. and that combined with the gearbox, that's its biggest sort of negative. There are a couple of other smaller ones. So something I found incredibly annoying was the side stand. Again, I've never come across something as difficult to put down. There's a tiny button that you need to sort of grab with your foot that's really tricky to do anyway, and it's tucked right up under the exhaust. So you've got about a centimetre square to try and get. So yeah, that was probably easily to sort, but really annoying. Any other negatives? Just the small things like no fuel gauge and just a few small things like that really. So not loads of negatives, but I like to give an unbiased review of all the stuff that I ride. So in summary, what do I think? I think it's a really good fun bike, but it's let down by the engine gearbox a bit. It handled a lot better than I expected, and the suspension and comfort were great. And as I said, one of the massive points of it, it looks a fantastic bike. So as I mentioned earlier, I had this bike for 5 days, and I was in Majorca for those 5 days and riding on all sorts of different roads there. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Vintage Motors in Majorca. They have 3 different offices in Palma and a really good selection of bikes. All the bikes we looked at in their sort of showroom were all pretty new, all looked good and looked really well maintained. When I picked this Moto Guzzi up, it just had new tyres on it, and you can tell it's been looked after. I think it had something like 20,000 kilometres on the clock and is a 2016 model, but it drove perfectly. So the friends I was with, they had 2 other bikes, and again, they never missed a beat, looked immaculate, has obviously been well looked after. So I highly recommend you check out Vintage Motors in Majorca. And finally, if you've enjoyed this video, then please do give it a like, leave a comment, ask any questions, that kind of stuff. If you're new to the channel, then please do subscribe. If you click the little bell icon, you'll also get notified of the new videos. And these are published weekly, usually on a Monday evening. So I hope you found that useful. Like I say, please give it a like and subscribe, and I'll see you next week.